Hello and welcome to The Office Field Guide. My name's Chris and we're reviewing every episode of The Office ever. Today we're looking at grief counseling. This one was written by Jennifer Celotta and directed by Roger Nygard. This episode aired on October 12th, 2006 and was viewed by 8.8 million people. The setup for this one is that Michael learns that Ed Truck, the former manager of Dunder Mifflin Scranton branch, has passed away. As grief sets in, The Office takes a darker tone as they explore the effects of grief, loss, and pain. Meanwhile, Jim tries to find chips for Karen.
What is my store number? 6. Wait, no, I'll call you back.
And so for the trivia for this episode, maybe only the most knowledgeable and eagle-eyed fans will know this one without looking it up. Out of all of the staff shown working at the Scranton office during this fateful day, which character had the audacity to not attend the Bird funeral? And with that, let's start this session.
No one asked you anything ever?
So when I sat down to write this episode, I really didn't think I'd have a lot to talk about, but I ended up having a lot. So let's get this going. As I mentioned, Roger Nygard is the one who directed this episode. It's a new name for me, so I did a little research on him. According to IMDb, Nygard does it all, with credits for editor, director, writer, producer, and a slew of other things. He seems to be most well known for his late 90s documentary called Trekkies that explored the sincere fandom of Star Trek. And then today, he seems to be getting most of his work currently as an editor on Curb Your Enthusiasm and a handful of other shows over the last couple years. I'll put the IMDb link in the description. I found an interview from Den of Geek in which the interviewer asked him what was it like to come on and direct an episode of The Office and how much creative license could he take with it. And Nygard said, television episodes are the domain of the writer-producers. You are there to service their vision. The Office is fully scripted, but there's always a little room to play when it's warranted. The first cuts are around 45 minutes, so you often have to cut the episodes in half for air. So I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I'll assume that he maybe didn't have as much fun or as a rewarding experience as he had hoped from this, as he never directed another episode of The Office again. And what's interesting about this episode is that there's a few hotly debated topics from it. The first one is that we know for sure that Ed Truck passed away, as we heard it from a credible source.
So I wanted to let you know that we lost Ed Truck.
Okay, let me see if I have his cell.
What we learn later in the episode is that Ed Truck was decapitated after a drunk driving accident, which this information comes from a relatively unreliable source.
Creed.
So really the debate is, was Creed telling the truth? And ultimately, the show doesn't explore this. It's up for you to decide. My gut is that Creed just completely made it up. We know Creed's extremely unreliable.
Oh, I'm engaged to Pam.
I thought you were gay.
Then why would you want to set me up with her daughter?
I don't know.
I think he probably just connected Ed Truck, semi-truck, decapitated.
He leaves work, he's on his way home. Wham! His cappa is detated from his head.
And the other debate from grief counseling is one that I had never even heard of until I started researching this episode. There seems to be a debate on what Pam was actually doing in this episode. It seems to be that her actions can be read as genuinely trying to help Michael deal with his grief, or she was just doing a long prank on Michael. And I hadn't ever thought of this before, so forgive me if this isn't really a debate, but I found several critics from the original reviews of this episode that lauded Pam's pranks in this one, listing the funeral as her greatest prank ever. So let me know what your thoughts on these debates are. There's plenty of more clips that I want to get to, but I'm going to work them in along the way. So with that, let's get to the deeper meaning.
Why don't you explain this to me like I'm 5?
Sometimes an episode of The Office has some deep abstract thesis that's buried in metaphor or the connection of diverging plot lines. And sometimes the title of the episode is the thesis statement. Grief is defined as deep sorrow. Typically, we correlate it to the sorrow experienced at the death of someone close. And as long as there's been storytelling in human history, there have been tales told on how to tame the torn heart.
When I found out that she asked her manager to remove her breathing tube so she could die.
Wow. And my cousin, Mufasa, he was trampled to death by a pack of wildebeests.
And then my Uncle Bernie died, and so me and my best friend, we had to pretend like he was alive.
The concept of grief has been described in a series of emotions that Michael so eloquently summarizes.
There are 5 stages to grief, which are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance.
I hold to the idea that everyone's a unique butterfly, and there's probably not a scientific process to really understand grief. But I think it is intended to be a decent way to frame the seemingly consistent rationale that those experiencing sorrow tend to have. But I do think that there's a bit of a red herring here, as on the outside, Michael seems to be all about his employees' grief.
Job to try to get them all the way through to acceptance. And if not acceptance, then just depression. If I can get them depressed, then I'll have done my job.
He's really the only one experiencing any grief in this episode. And to Nygaard's point, there's a lot of this episode left on the cutting room floor. So I'll tell you how I read Michael's actions in this episode. At first, with the news of Ed Truck, he was completely indifferent, as he really didn't even like Ed in the first place.
Ed Truck. Ugh. Ed Truck was the manager before me. Horrible. He hated fun. It was like, oh, Ed Truck is walking toward us. Stop having fun.
Once Kelly shows him the smallest amount of sympathy, Michael, well, he's like a toddler that just fell and scraped his knee. If you, the adult, freak out, that toddler will mimic your emotions and equally freak out. But this does set Michael down a path of grief. Death is a reminder to all of us that we're not going to live forever.
Look, I know this is hard for you, but death's just a part of life.
And in memorial services, while we remember the good things about the deceased,
Maybe it's that same bird that surprised Oscar that one morning with a special present from above.
Oh, I remember that. That was so funny.
death forces us to look inward, and we're left with the choice of what we're going to do with the rest of the time that we have left. What's comedically explored in this episode is that the only one in denial in this episode is Michael. He's in denial over what he's actually grieving.
The guy who had my job has died, and nobody cares. And he sat at my desk.
Michael's undoubtedly fearing that his life will ultimately mean nothing.
It's been a tough day, but it's good to let it show.
I mean, how many times do I have to confirm plans with Ryan for him to know that we have a date tonight?
That when he's dead and gone, those people that he cares so much about will inevitably not blink an eye when he's gone. Pam seems to be the only one who's keen to this.
Died, and nobody cares. And he sat at my desk.
Michael.
And that's why I think she goes out of her way to put on this funeral.
Did I wake up this morning thinking I'd be throwing together a bird funeral? You never can tell what your day here is going to turn into.
I think in spite of everything that Michael has done and said to her, Pam sees past all of that to the human who's needing to be seen. And she sees him.
Because I'm sure that there were lots of other birds out there who cared for him very much. He will not be forgotten.
Amen.
So the message here is, if you're experiencing grief, find a Pam who will tell you that you matter. And if you can't, let me be your Pam. You matter. Or if you're not experiencing grief right now, be a Pam to somebody. Tell those people around you that they really do matter.
There is such a thing as good grief. Just ask Charlie Brown.
Or I don't know, maybe this whole episode exists to perpetuate the Hers brand of chips.
Nothing. They're just out of Hers chips.
Oh. Actually, that is interesting. The B plot of this does mimic the A plot. You have one character experiencing a loss, then another character going out of their way and over the top to find closure for the character who's experienced loss. But I digress. With that, let's dish out some Dundies.
And then I gotta get him to the Dundies.
The Dundie for the best recorder and vocal duet in The Office goes to Pam and Dwight.
You are the sunshine that lights my heart within.
All right, moving on. The Dundie for the fake scientific fact goes to Michael Scott.
He's covered in germs and bacteria. Now you can't get diseases from a bird.
Okay, I really just wanted to include that clip in this field guide, and I couldn't think of a better place. But with that, let's move on to the ratings.
What gives you the right?
Okay, and before we rate this thing, let's give you the answer to that trivia question. Who was the character heinous enough to skip the bird funeral? The answer is Luann Kelly, the mysterious woman who lurks in the background over the first few seasons that causes longtime fans of the show to pause when she's on screen, take a picture of her, and post that picture online and ask, who is this? Well, it's Luann. It could be her grief counseling betrayal that is the reason why she only appears in 2 more episodes. Does Michael fire her for this obvious slight against him? Who knows, as we didn't even know her name until Greg Daniels spoke about her in an interview sometime way after the series ended. Anyway, let's rate this thing. As for the cold opening, it's fun. I give this a 3 out of 5. It's not amazing, but Steve Carell is pretty gold in it, and Pam's pranking prowess is a solid reminder that even without Jim in the Scranton office, it's still worth sticking around with them.
With cream and sugar?
And as for this episode, I give it a 3 out of 5 as well. There are great bits in this episode, and grief counseling is chock full of genius. But I dare you to ask anyone to recap this episode from memory, assuming that they haven't just been binging the show repeatedly during this whole corona quarantine, and have them explain this episode. It'll probably go something like this.
Decapitated, whole big thing. We had a funeral for a bird.
Which is my main point with this episode. The first half is kind of boring, and Michael's insufferable, not completely in a bad way, because it does pay off at the end, but the bird funeral probably is the thing that most people would remember from this episode. But that's just what I think about grief counseling. What do you think about this episode? What are your favorite bits? Leave it in the comments. I'd love to hear what you have to say. If you haven't already, consider subscribing. Next week, we're going to be looking at the initiation episode, a Ryan and Dwight-centric episode set at the fabled Schrute Farms, and for the first time on screen, we get to see Mose Schrute. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Okay.